Hi, I'm Rob, and welcome to the Uncut Network. Every month we rotate between directors, actors, and super specific genres. We cover everything from exploitation to things your parents will absolutely approve of, relative unknowns to household names, and everything in between. The Uncut Network is the movie podcast with all of the niches, and to cover all of those things and more, I am joined by Vincent. Hello there.
I want you to round up every vicious criminal and gunslinger on the internet. I want rustlers, cutthroats, murderers, bounty hunters, desperados, mugs, pugs, thugs, nitwits, halfwits, dimwits, vipers, snipers, conmen, muggers, buggerers, bushwhackers, hornswogglers, horse thieves, train robbers, bank robbers, ass kickers, shit kickers, Methodists, and podcasters.
Tag yourself, I'm the hornswoggler.
I've always got to remember this. I've always got to finish with Vincent because he'll upstage everybody with his intros.
Oh, shucks, man.
He's very good at his intros. And also with us today are Graham.
Hiya.
Not even an attempt.
that drama, and then we get a hiya. And Mark, hello there.
Yeah, hello.
I've done this backwards. That'll learn me. But how are you all this evening?
Great, yeah. After we've managed to convene, I think it's been a long journey, a long
my panic attack is slowly receding now. It's a general cluster. But yeah, other than that,
there was a long hard ride to get here, but you know, I'm feeling rested now. So's my mule. It's all good.
Yeah. I think if you've not picked up on the clues of what we're doing today...
yes, I did it. 1980.
And we haven't caught your attention and we're doing something very wrong.
So, this week we are doing westerns, specifically revisionist westerns from the 1970s. So I really have to open this up to all of you first. We can't really talk about revisionist westerns without talking about westerns as a whole. So, Mark, what's your feelings on the western as a sort of a very, very broad subgenre?
hated it as a kid. As a kid, westerns always seemed to be the films that my mum and dad and my grandparents would watch. Usually it was Sunday afternoon, and you had that. It was mixed up in that sort of school following day feeling, and just very boring moralistic drama that I just didn't really understand. And there was no jokes. There's no. Didn't get it, but absolutely grew to love it as a teenager and a young person, and now in the grand old age of 44.
Graham?
I had quite a strong attraction to westerns as a kid for the aesthetics. You know, I like the deserts and the big blue skies and the wagon trains, but I never really understood them as a genre until I saw a film that I know you and I both love, Rob, Jim Jarmusch's Dead Man.
Yes,
which,
excellent.
Yeah, a later revisionist western, but it did make me think a lot more about the sort of society that would have existed back in the Wild West days. And from there on, I moved into spaghetti westerns, which I think we decided to cover because the difference between the 60s spaghetti western and a 70s spaghetti western isn't that great. Whereas in terms of American westerns, you're talking about the difference between how the West was won and the Great Northfield, Minnesota raid, which is enormous. It's a whole different world. And now I think...
I have no idea what any of that means.
Trust me, Rob, they have. and now they're probably my favourite genre. They are more of an occasional treat than something I'll watch all the time, but there is something about watching a really good Western that makes me think, oh yeah, this is what the movies are about.
Yeah. And finishing us off, I'm doing it right this time. Vincent?
Yeah, they're all right. I find it fascinating what Mark said about growing up with Westerns being something that you associated with your parents watching them, because I remember my parents being fairly quite, I wouldn't say anti-Western, but not keen on them because what they would be typically representing was fairly retrograde, misogynistic, and racist attitudes. The whole idea of cowboys and Indians is inherently racist, and it was the kind of things, I come from a very right-on, liberal, left-leaning family. Probably explains a lot about my own politics, and so I was I had a bias against them, and then I watched a few, I think, as a teenager, and often found them dull or didn't really get them. The first Western I think I remember watching properly from start to finish was Unforgiven, which now I actually class as one of my top 10 films of all time. So I certainly got into them. And being a scholar of cinema and with particular interest in American culture and cinema, I always find the Western fascinating in terms of the genre's expression of myth, of the frontier, the tension between civilization and wilderness. And I love the ongoing debate about, oh, the Western's dead. Oh, look, it's back. And the Western's dead. Oh, look, it's back. Oh, and it's never going to die. I think as long as, and the fact that it is, on the one hand, it can seem like such a specific genre that's technically coming from a historical period of essentially like, sort of 1860 to 1890, but isn't really about any true part of history. It is very much a myth. It is arguably the true American myth. And possibly that's why, American cinema has continued to produce it and revise it, and reinvent it, while it's also been adopted around the world in so many different forms, like the spaghetti westerns. I mean, to take a spaghetti western, the title Once Upon a Time in the West has been utilized in so many other situations. There's Once Upon a Time in the Midlands, Once Upon a Time
Was that the original?
Once Upon a Time in the West, I believe, was the first one.
That's where it comes from.
Yeah.
Oh,
But I could be wrong. But yeah, it's the Western remains a fascinating genre in terms of what it has said, what it continues to say, and, as we'll talk about today, what we can go back and look at it from different periods. It's a great, as genre cinema often is, it's a great barometer of the cultural zeitgeist at the time of its production, which we shall certainly be talking about in relation to the 1970s.
Absolutely. And I think I've got to sort of represent the full sort of spectrum of opinions here. I don't like them. But it's sort of it's more complicated than that. It's in sort of as a general body of work, I'm not fond of them, but there's specific ones that will cut through. Like Graham mentioned, there's Dead Man, which I think is outstanding. There was a box set that Arrow put out. I think Mark did one of the preceding ones. It had Bandidos on it, which I think is wonderful. Another one, I think it was, what's it called there? And God Said to Cain, which has Klaus Kinski in.
Oh, yeah.
I think is a very good movie too. So there's like ones that cut through, ones that have sort of an element of style about them. But sort of as a genre en masse, well, I think it's sort of like the Werther's originals of cinema for me. It's a bit stuffy. It's a bit not for me. I mean, I didn't have the sort of context of growing up with it either, because my dad showed me like Jean-Claude Van Damme movies and Bruce Lee movies. Can't stand Jean-Claude Van Damme now, but Bruce Lee movies, yeah, still. But yeah,
Solid
it just
grounding.
never happened for me, Westerns. It was just one of those things that other people watched, really. It was the thing that was always on Sunday afternoon on like Channel 4 or BBC 2. That's it, really.
Right.
Yeah.
So this is a vague question, but we can't talk about revisionist westerns without saying what is revisionist about them. So it's sort of the elephant in the room as far as this podcast goes. So who's equipped to explain that one?
Whose idea was this originally?
Probably mine.
Go on.
I can't remember it 100%, but it was probably mine. Yeah, I think that the revisionist Western is sort of produced through two forces. The first is the loosening of Hollywood censorship standards throughout the 1960s, which I'm sure we'll find opportunities to talk about how these films deal with violence and other taboo materials. But that obviously affects how a Western looks. Suddenly you don't have this situation where someone gets shot and they just go, ooh, and fall over. The other thing is, of course, Watergate and Vietnam, and the fact that America was coming up to its bicentennial in the 1970s, and a lot of Americans had never felt worse about the direction their country was going in. There was a burgeoning Native American rights movement going on, and people were starting to look back at what was really a sort of unbroken chain of mythologization from the days of Buffalo Bill taking his traveler's circus round America and lying about all of the gunfights that he wasn't involved in, through to like the John Ford and the Anthony Mann Westerns, which all portrayed the colonization of the American West, with few exceptions, mostly portrayed it as basically the white heroes you are descended from, you, the audience, are descended from, went out west and made this savage land into a place where, which could call itself a civilized country. And as soon as people start doubting whether or not America was a civilized country, they started doubting that myth, and that produced some of the films we talked about today.
It's funny you say about the having the doubt about whether America is a civilized country, and here we are, 50 years after the release of these particular films we'll be talking about, and
everything's great. It's all shook out great, hasn't it? Yeah.
Well, I was thinking specifically of the January 6th riot, the insurrection at the Capitol, when one of the leaders of that was wearing a kind of a Wild West outfit.
Yeah, that was weird. That was very weird.
Well, that whole day was weird.
Yeah,
it really was. Yeah, but it's true. Any time someone in America wants to portray themselves as fighting for freedom, they reach for Western iconography, and it sort of doesn't matter whether that's a justified cause or some white dude trying to overthrow democracy wearing a stupid sort of cartoon Indian costume. It always goes back to the Western.
Yeah.
Which
Excellent.
I guess goes to demonstrate the continued resonance of the Western as this cultural myth, in the same way that in Britain we would reach back to King Arthur or Robin Hood, or even more recent. We might reach back to the kings immortalized in some of our literature. Think of like Henry V from Shakespeare. We reach back to these myths, and America does it as well. It just has a much shorter history.
Yeah, I should point out, if anyone thinks I've been slightly harsh on America, that as Vincent notes, most of our legendary heroes didn't exist. The James Younger gang might not have been exactly how the movies depicted them, but King Arthur did not exist.
Yeah, and also other sort of people who would be heroes in sort of anti-establishment sense. Our mythology is we burnt them to death, and we celebrate it every November by celebrating the one person who tried to blow up Parliament by burning effigy of him to death. Yay, the system.
Yes. Anyone think that V for Vendetta feels more like a documentary every year?
Yes, yeah, there is that.
All that explanation of the Western, all wonderful. The brass tacks of this podcast is we've got to talk about some movies. And the three movies we've picked are from 1971, The Hired Hand, from 1973, High Plains Drifter, and from 74, the wild card of this bunch, Blazing Saddles.
Yes.
From Mel Brooks. So we'll start with probably the least well-known of the three, then, 1971's The Hired Hand, directed and starring Peter Fonda.
It's just a waste living like this, aren't you? You gonna go with Harry? You ain't gonna go to the coast?
Where you gonna go then?
Home.
How long is it gonna take you to ride back?
A week?
Hereabouts? I mean, what if she's married?
Is he dead?
You shoot him.
because it's a fairly simple story, isn't it? You've got three cowboys played by Peter Fonda, Warren Oates, and that dude. There's one of these people who's slightly less famous than the others, but they are three cowboys who were going out west purportedly to take part in the great sort of frontier gold rush. But of course, Peter Fonda's Harry has another agenda. He wants to reunite with his estranged wife Hannah and his daughter at their farmstead. And when he gets there, she does not immediately fall into his arms as the women in pre-revisionist Westerns does. She's quite happy to be rid of him. She's got a lot of sort of bitterness about how their relationship ended, and he decides to prove his worth by being a hired hand on her farmstead. Now, if that sounds a bit low incident for a Western, there is a total bastard called McVeigh who he has had a run-in with before, shall we say, and is looking for revenge as well. But it's really a very slow, very sad, romantic, dreamlike. They call it an acid western. It's not an it's not an acid western in the same way that something like El Topo is, where it's like actively surreal.
There was a German one as well, which is particularly weird.
What's that one?
I can't. I mean, I'll have to look at its name while you're talking, and I'll bring it up later, so I'll sound intelligent. But yeah, there is a German western. It was pretty weird. That's an acid western. But Mark, what's your feelings on The Hired Hand?
I love it. I absolutely love it. It's really it like Graham said. It seems like a very simple premise, a very simple story, but there's so much sort of symbolic techniques used in it that I just find really striking, and it's sold terribly well. I mean, I'm looking at a fly leaflet for it at the moment, and the strapline on it is "To the woman he lost for the revenge he craves," which is not this film, is it really? This film opens with a symbolic shot of sparkling water, sunset on the water, and Peter Fonda as literally a fisher of men, really.
Yes.
There's a lot of religious, quasi-religious Jesus overtones to this film, I find. Quite apart from the fact that the Bible reading at the funeral for the guy whose name we don't know is...
the character's called Dan. I can't remember the actor.
Right.
Robert Pratt.
Robert Pratt. There we go. The gospel reading is the hidden gospel, Doubting Thomas's gospel, which I found really interesting.
Right.
Yeah, it's that threw me a bit. I thought, right, so we're on sort of really, because it's been a long time since I've seen this, and I'm watching it again the other day, and it's like, oh, there really is a lot of religion in this, and it got me thinking. I mean, they cross the Rio Grande into Mexico, don't they? Into a place that you didn't recognise at first, and then when he gets there, he realises they've been there before, and it's a bad newsville, basically, isn't it?
Yeah.
And it got me wondering, is this sort of purgatory? And is what happens with Peter Fonda's character after, is that like Christ coming down from the cross? This is the life you could lead if you give up now, kind of thing.
How apt that you should say this, because Hannah's played by Werner Bloom, who would go on to play the Virgin Mary in The Last Temptation of Christ.
Yeah, this is another thing that came up in my head watching it. It's like, there's a lot of... I mean, Scorsese, I think, is a fan of this film anyway, he must have thought of that. He must have been thinking of that. But it's just such a beautiful film, and it's so wonderfully written by Alan Sharp, Scottish playwright, who I think before this he did the very first Play for Today with Ray Davies from the Kinks.
Oh, no way.
Yeah. He did go on to have quite a good career in Hollywood, but it strikes me that it's a Scottish guy writing what is very
a kind of archetypal American story.
Yeah. I mean, I think Peter Fonda said that this isn't a revisionist Western, because this is how the West was, and every other Western prior to that is the revisionist one.
That's good.
So
Yeah, I like
the fact
that.
Alan Sharp could get a lot of the cadences and the dialogue and that, and there's some beautiful lines in this, like my horse threw a plate back there, instead of like a shoe or anything like that. And, somebody's really done the research on what words were used at the time.
Well, Nick Cave, Australian, he's done a few decent westerns.
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely.
Very true.
Sometimes it takes an outsider, doesn't it, to nail what's going on in a particular genre or a particular country. For me, the big giveaway in this film really is the dead body that's floating along the river at the start of the film, the little girl.
Yeah.
And when the young lad tries to get it, Peter Fonda says something like, it'd fall apart in your hands if you try and pick it up. And it's that idea of like, you can't go back, you can't get that life, you can't really seize on something that is, it's beyond your reach. You're not going to be able to recapture this. But I think one of the most striking things in this film that it took a friend of mine called John years ago to point it out to me, because I watched it and turned him onto it. And John's one of these guys who's you watch something and throw something back to you that you never noticed. And you're like, how have I not noticed that? And it's Peter Fonda's family, it's his daughter. They never say anything to each other. They're in scenes, but they don't look at each other. They never say anything to each other. And it's so weird that his whole sort of modus operandi is I'm tired of the life on the road. I want to get back to be a family man. And he pretty much ignores his daughter all the way through the film. It's so strange.
Vincent, what's your feelings on The Hired Hand?
Well, firstly, I commend and agree with everything that Graham and Mark have said. This was my first time seeing it. I had not heard of this film until it came up as one to discuss for this podcast. And I'm really glad I did see it. So thank you for bringing it up and recommending it. I thought it was reflective, it was meditative and measured. And I think what you mentioned, Graham, about it being this, I don't know if I really know what an acid Western would look like, but I do think it's dreamlike. Something I noticed right from those opening shots that you were talking about, Mark. It's there's a lot of visual overlays where there's like a sort of slow crossfade between the river and face, and then later on between different parts of these vistas. And I think what it does is it creates this very wistful sensation. This is a film that is wistful, and the arc of the main character, Harry Collins, played by Peter Fonda, is all about that. He is wistful for the life he left behind, for the life he has lost. And I will say, because I was watching it for the first time, not knowing what was coming, I probably wasn't picking up on the sort of things that a repeat viewing might have shown. It's like, yep, this is about a life that is passed you by. Where I think it's interesting, it's revisionism is its revising of gender relations, because what we have here is a man who wants to get back to his wife, to his daughter, to his family. He wants to be a family man. And if he's got to spend time working, then that's then a man's going to do what a man's got to do. So in that respect, there's that sort of the direction of the arc of the male protagonist is sort of the revision of what is typically the case in the Western. However, it also has the more typical drive for the Western man of, as was said in the tagline you described, Mark, of choice between, was it his family and vengeance? But I don't think vengeance is, as you say, it's not selling the film, because what is really the alternative drive for Harry is a homosocial bond. It's his friend, his friend Arch Harris, played by Warren Oates. We've got here a man who's got to try to choose between his wife and his best friend. Now, somebody may want to go into like, ooh, is it a gay Western? no, it isn't, shut the fuck up, go away. It's possible, to have relationships between two people of the same gender and it not be about sex. And that, I think, is really interesting because...
There is a lingering
all right, fine.
touch. There's a lingering touch on that at the very end, but I don't think it goes beyond what you said, like it's a relationship between two friends.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's this homosocial bond in competition with a heterosexual bond. And the way that the film plays out, I think, is very interesting in terms of performing what I would consider something of a critique of the standard mythological ideology that we find in the Western, that it's about the man doing what he's got to do, and then he does the more generically expected thing to do. And I think that the way the film resolves, the way it plays out, does continue that critique. I guess, I don't know if we're avoiding spoilers, but I am avoiding spoilers anyway, in terms of the way it plays out in that competition of what wins out between the heterosexual and the homosocial. And I find that fascinating because, apart from anything else, I don't like to think about the way a film compares to what reality might be, because frankly, it's not. Film isn't reality. It never will be. And attempting to suggest whether this is what the West was really like, I think is a bit unlikely. I think it's a bit of a false argument. But where I think it is, I can get on board with the idea that, you know what, if two guys spend 7 years, as Archie says at one point, out there, the only thing they know is each other, if they stick together that long, then yeah, I would expect there to be a close bond. And it makes sense that he'd have this very strong sense of devotion and loyalty. If we want to do a more contemporary, speaking of myths, it's like Frodo and Sam in The Lord of the Rings. I suspect if either Harry or Archie had to be carried up a mountain, then the other would do it.
Yeah. I think what Vincent says about the realism of it, you can go too far with realism in films, but I think it's that tension that makes it incredible to me. I mean, I'll put my cards on the table. It is one of my favourite films. I thought it was one of my favourite films when I first saw it, and revisiting it's only cemented that opinion. But the women in Westerns are normally, like the women in 50s Westerns look like magazine cover girls. And when you see Verna Bloom for the first time here, she's a striking woman, but she's wearing no makeup. She looks like she works outdoors. She looks like she's run a farm in Harry's absence. And I think on one level, Hired Hand is a very realist Western. It's about the classic kind of realist fiction concerns of hard work and struggling to get by economically, and disastrous luck that can befall someone living on the breadline. But it has this other element. It has this acid Western element of the superimpositions that at one point make it look like they're riding their horses through the clouds. These dreamy elements like Bruce Langhorne's score, which is all put through gorgeous score. And a lot of it is using traditional instrumentation, but it's put through delay pedals and phaser pedals. So it has this kind of vague 1970s psychedelic edge in it. And also, I think you have to, while we're crediting Fonda's collaborators, you have to mention Frank Mazzola, the editor, who had just, and this is tying into a very recent podcast you and I have done, Rob, he had just finished cutting together Performance.
Very talented man.
Hugely talented man, and you can see that kind of dreamlike, associative rather than literal editing style that he learned on Performance being applied to this very different subject matter.
I think the one thing that we haven't really mentioned is the pacing. We sort of danced around it a little bit, but this is, to use that term that so many people seem to dislike with a passion, slow cinema.
Yeah.
And I think it works particularly well for Westerns because it allows the cinematography to actually speak something about the West. There's lots of these old movies where it was paced so very, very quickly that it didn't have time to sort of linger on sort of the actual place that these things took part in. And the cinematographer, I'm not going to try to pronounce it, but I'm going to try to pronounce it anyway.
Sigismund.
Oh, thank you for doing that.
Vilma Sigismund, he did McCabe and Mrs. Miller as well, didn't he? So he's got really good form for revisionist Western.
Yeah. So his patience and just observing these vast vistas, it's about as beautiful as Westerns get, really, because, you know, America, I don't know if it's shot in America. It might be one of these that's shot in like France, Spain, Italy. They're shot all over Europe, these things.
I think it is America. I think it is sort of Mexican border, isn't it? I think, because I think it definitely is the Rio Grande that they cross.
But these vast spaces are stunning, and you don't really get the chance to sort of luxuriate in it. And this one of the few Westerns that actually does. You know, it takes its time with what it's showing.
It's like Vincent said, it's meditative, isn't it?
Shot in West Sands National Monument, Cabazon, New Mexico, Española, New Mexico. So, and some scenes in the backlot at MGM Studios. So, it's a US shoot.
Mm-hmm. I wouldn't like to say whether that's rare or not, because I don't know enough about Westerns to make that sort of grand statement. But yeah, it's a stunning movie.
Yeah, absolutely.
Slow and deliberate, but stunning nonetheless.
Yeah. No, I'm glad you guys like it, because it's one that I think I might have suggested. I'm not sure. It might have been me or Graham, or we both.
Yeah, I absolutely
rush into it very quickly
over this.
Yeah.
Well, I'm glad you did. Yeah. As I said, first time watch for me. Rob, had you seen it previously?
I hadn't. No. I mean, first I heard of it was when it was released through Arrow Academy,
wasn't it? Yeah.
When they were still doing an Academy, and it wasn't all Arrow Video, so it's gone back a few years. But that's the first I heard of it.
I think my first was Tartan DVD, which is going back even further.
But that was actually, it's funny you should mention that. That early 2000s Tartan release was the first time it had been released in the UK.
Yeah.
And this is one of 3 films that were offered to Peter Fonda, Jack Nicholson, and Dennis Hopper to direct in the aftermath of Easy Rider as a sort of thank you for that making such an unbelievable amount of money. And they all, to some extent, tanked, and they all have cult followings. But it's interesting that Dennis Hopper's The Last Movie has always had a cult following because it's a mad, overreaching, sort of visionary, drug-soaked epic. And Peter Fonda just made a really quiet, small film that worked. And it was small enough to get ignored for decades. But as I think we all agree, it still holds up beautifully today.
And he made a film his dad liked, which, you know...
Yeah.
Says it all, doesn't it?
I mean, for anyone, that's a nice moment, but for a Fonda, that's a particularly good moment.
When your dad's the star of the Oxbow incident, you know.
Yeah,
that's another one of the few Westerns that I like. That's a good movie.
Wouldn't, isn't it?
Yeah. Anything else about The Hired Hand before we move on to...
Would we call it a feminist Western?
I think you can make a case for that. Yeah, it certainly deconstructs as Vincent was saying, the kind of expectation of macho heroism that you have.
I would call it certainly, I mean, part of its revisionist credentials are it is one that revises gender relations. I think it's still very focused on masculinity, so I wouldn't go so far as calling it feminist. But perhaps it's one that is acknowledging. It's almost tipping its hat, ma'am, in a genuinely, I think, respectful fashion.
Which makes a change for the time, really, doesn't it? There's not many of the contemporaries.
Yeah, we'll come on to that.
We'll come to that, won't we?
Yes, and I think that's as good of a segue as I could ever possibly get, because the next movie that we have lined up of this threesome is 1973's High Plains Drifter, directed by Clint Eastwood, with the rather spiffing sort of tagline, "Welcome to Hell." So
nice.
Right you are, gentlemen. I'll be right with you. Just have a chair.
You don't like our company? What's the matter with you?
Well, High Plains Drifter features a mysterious stranger comes to the small settlement of Lago and is hired to bring the townsfolk together in an attempt to hold off 3 outlaws who are on their way. That's, by the way, that's the synopsis from the IMDb. So, and what's notable about that is it could be the summation of many a Western, not least Westerns starring and directed by Clint Eastwood, who, when you talk about the Western, is a figure that who you can't ignore, really has to be discussed in, I think, quite a lot, who offers a lot to be discussed. Now, what High Plains Drifter does in terms of its revisionist and its deconstruction of the Western genre is it uses genre tropes. The tropes of you've got this mysterious stranger who, notably, remains unnamed throughout the film. The film also features a lot of interesting overlays, visual overlays, not unlike The Hired Hand, but unlike The Hired Hand, does so in a way that is very much to do with violence, is to do with betrayal, that is to do with guilt in the way it puts together. So, whereas The Hired Hand is looking at something that is very wistful and in some ways quite romanticized, High Plains Drifter isn't. I think it is in many ways quite a de-romanticizing Western. It deals with a lot of interesting ideas like retribution and vengeance. It's got some quite Old Testament-esque judgment aspects to it, all of which are really interesting. And I think it is a strongly directed, strongly performed, strongly designed film. And it is horribly misogynistic. This was the second time I'd seen it, right? I'd seen it some years ago, and there was a point quite early on where I was like, ew, that's horrible. And then I watched it again in preparation for this, and I thought, oh no, that's really bad. And it's worse. And then there's a scene later on when it does much the same thing. And yeah, it's very odd that in some respects it is being this is not a Western that one could in any way call feminist. So it's a film I am very ambivalent about because I can admire a lot about it, and I think it engages with and it uses the tropes of the Western genre, not unlike The Hired Hand, in a way that is very interesting, and then has this sort of odd section of right, yes, and what all women want is to fuck Clint Eastwood, which I can't help feeling is more than a little self-aggrandizing. It's like, I'm the director and I'm the star and I'm intensely desirable and I'm going to make sure every woman I encounter knows that. What? Why is that causing anybody to have a problem? I like Clint Eastwood as a director, but he's problematic as well.
Yeah. The elephant in the room here is, I think, about 20 minutes in broad daylight, he just...
Yes.
It's even less than that. He just takes a woman and who just approaches him, just chastises and screaming at him, and as punishment for that, he just rapes her in broad daylight, just like that.
Yeah.
And not only does no one bat an eyelid about this, it's heavily implied during that rape sequence that she's enjoying it, which
that's the icky bit.
Quite stomach turning.
Welcome to the 1970s.
I will offer a sort of a suitably revisionist argument about this, which is that, I mean, I don't disagree with these points. I think there often is a slightly self-aggrandizing streak in the way that Eastwood directs himself in on-screen relationships with women. Not all the time. You couldn't say it about The Bridges of Madison County, but you sure as fuck can with Pale Rider or what's that one where he has a threesome at the age of like about 9,000?
The Mule. Where he looks like a paying, dug-up mummy. And that's 2 20-year-old girls pulling at him,
Yes.
I'm not going to kink shame. Not going to kink shame.
I am. But yeah.
We won't shame them. We might shame him.
Yes. I I think there's another interpretation of the storyline with Callie that we've been alluding to, which is that, I mean, the rape scene is horrible when it happens, and it's particularly horrible because it's Clint Eastwood. He was at the peak of his box office appeal and the peak of his coolness, and you know that there were some people in that audience back in '73 going, yeah, go on, Clint. I don't think he has diffused his own star persona as effectively as Don Siegel did in The Beguiled, which deals with some very similar themes.
Yeah.
But I think there's also a level of complexity to it. I think Callie may look like she's enjoying it towards the end of the rape scene, but I think she's genuinely play acting that in order to get him to leave her alone. Because later she is very angry about it. She hasn't forgiven him at all. And she comes through when he's being bathed and shoots him. And the woman who's attending to him has this very misogynistic line about she's just angry that you didn't go back for more. But the stranger, the Eastwood character, has a very different reaction, which is, why did it take her so long? He thinks he deserved that shot for what he did. And I think there's two things in here that are kind of a key to the attitude of High Plains Drifter. Firstly, it is a doomer western. I was looking up Letterboxd reviews from my friends, and it turns out that all of the people I follow on Letterboxd who are younger than me thought this was great. And despite that ugly plot line, I can kind of see why, because this is not a Western for when you're going through the Nixon administration and thinking, oh, was America really great? It's a Western for when you're going through the Trump administration and thinking the world is shit. We're all going to roast on a dying planet. Nothing is worthwhile. If you're ever in that mood, High Plains Drifter is the Western for you. But the other thing, which I'm surprised we haven't addressed this yet, is that Clint Eastwood gets shot by Callie twice. She's got a good aim. There's no indication she's missed, and there isn't even a mark on him. Clint Eastwood in High Plains Drifter is a ghost.
Yeah.
There was a draft of the script originally where he was merely the brother of the person he was avenging.
Oh, wow.
And there's still kind of a trace of that in this, because he casts Buddy Van Horn, his long-term stunt double, in the role, and they do look similar. There's a sense that maybe this is more than just a parallel, maybe there's a resemblance there, but as soon as Eastwood got the script, he stripped all of that storyline out really ruthlessly, and he was very invested in the idea of this character as not just, as Vincent says, an Old Testament kind of guy who believes in Old Testament retribution, which you could say of a lot of Western protagonists, but that this guy is actually something supernatural. This is very close to horror movie territory, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah, fair comment, I think. I agree that it has this... one of the strengths of the film is it does kind of maintain that ambiguity throughout. I don't think it's ever explicitly said that he's a ghost, and not least because, I mean, one thing that's typically not associated with ghosts, I find, at least in my experience, observations, is corporeality. He's clearly, physical and solid. How's this for a weird comparison? The film that's out right now, All of Us Strangers, does a similar thing. I never in 50 years would I have imagined that connection. However, it does maintain, I think, that hint of something that is unusual, that is, potentially supernatural about him, that he is, because we have these a couple of times where there are these flashback sequences where we see Marshall Duggan being horsewhipped by the
savage scene,
by the three outlaws who are on their way back. And it's weird. When I was doing a bit of reading around for this recording, only then did I say, oh, that's not actually Eastwood in the flashbacks, because I thought it was. Because maybe that, just because the quality of the viewing I saw wasn't great. It was legal, don't worry. But but it's interesting that it is there is an obvious parallel there, and by presenting it through these strange crossfades and flashbacks, it's presenting a parallel while also helping to make the mysterious, unnamed gunslinger all the more ambiguous. Just to go back to I think the point you raised there is interesting, Graham, and I would like to agree with it. The idea of he deserves to be shot, and Callie's perspective. That's her name, is it? Callie, yeah. And she's totally justified. Played by Mariana Hill in what she does. However, they get together again later on. He comes to see her. She pulls out a gun. He disarms her, and then he's like, "Well, you're going to come and keep me company later, aren't you?" And of course, she does. And the thing that again made me queasy, the one other prominent female character who kind of feels like the closest thing this film has to a moral center, because it's a pretty amoral film.
Totally,
Sarah Belding, played by Verna Bloom. She is, she feels like the one person who's got a conscience. And then she goes to bed with him as well, pretty much because he says, "Well, you want to come to bed with me as well, don't you?" And she's like, "No, you're an awful man." "Oh, yes, I do." It's like bloody Goldfinger.
It is, yeah, it is.
I just, and again, I feel that I think it's misogynistic. B, I think it's really lazy. So again, I just wish that the gender aspects of it weren't there. You could have there'd be women in the town, but couldn't he just, ignore them? Yeah.
To return to the sort of the general plot concept, we've not really touched upon that all that much. The idea is that there's these three people return at the town, and basically the town council says, "We can give you whatever you want to just help us do this." And what happens is Clint Eastwood's Stranger basically uses this as an excuse to be horrible, really mean-spirited to literally everybody. He literally tears the town down, makes I never know the right term, dwarf? Is that the...
little person?
Small person, little person.
Yeah.
He makes him mayor. He has everybody paint the town red and address it as hell in sort of the sign. He really leaves no stone unturned about the treatment that he gives everybody who maybe was complicit in that sort of flashback.
It's revenge.
It's not just sort of it's not just a focused revenge. This is sort of everybody's guilty, really.
It's it's like Graham said, it's a morally bankrupt, bleak as fuck film, and everybody is complicit in something to some extent. It's the antithesis of John Ford Westerns. John Ford Westerns tend to praise the homesteader, don't they? These are brilliant people, they civilise society. Well, they turned up with business interests afterwards. And this is a business interest and not in my backyards and protecting yourself and fuck everybody else attitude, which is unheard of really in a lot of Hollywood Westerns, but were particularly prevalent in spaghetti Westerns. Primarily because a lot of spaghetti Western filmmakers were communists or had fought in the resistance. So, these are people who knew what collaboration was and knew what fascism did to a country. See, it's a bleak, horrible, misogynistic, violent Western, but I think it needs to be. I think it's a film that's saying something about what American society was founded on. And it's saying it was founded on this. It's founded on corruption. It's founded on brutality. It's founded on sexism and misogyny. It's founded on rape and violence. And it's just addressing it from that point of view, really. I find that really fascinating.
It is fascinating. My reservation about it is that I don't think it sticks the landing, because for all of the nasty things going on here that the film is highlighting, it still has the mysterious stranger be the hero. He may be an anti-hero, but he still does the thing. It's interesting, when the three outlaws arrive into town and the stranger has armed the town, he's turned it into their own militia, and then they turn out all of the townsfolk turn out to be completely useless. They run away, they drop their guns, they can't shoot straight. And then once a lot of them have either been overwhelmed, the stranger comes back. I guess we're in spoiler territory now. And the stranger is able to do what you expect that Western hero to do in a way that, say, the hired hand doesn't do that.
Yeah.
And I think that by doing that and having an ending that I thought the final sequence of this, it was when I was getting into this when I really think this is the sort of the Old Testament-esque nature of the film, where it's been painted, the town's been painted red. It's notable. I was struck by this film it's sharp-edged, but it's oddly colourful. It's the town of Largo is right by a lake, and we see the bright blue of the water. The sand is actually quite light-coloured, it's kind of yellow rather than baked brown by the sun, and the town is red. And then the climax taking place in this town at night, where it's where the buildings are either red or they're on fire, place is burning. It felt hellish. But then the ending still, the kind of coda of the film kind of gives it but you know what, it's still okay in some ways.
Yeah, I suppose look at it this way. Rob raised the issue of Eastwood essentially being hired by the town. And I suppose part of what it's doing is subjecting that idea of the hired gun who sorts everything out to some really serious critique. Because yes, he does clean up the town. He does the job he was meant to do. And he realises, as the similarly unearthly protagonist in J.B. Priestley's and Inspector Calls does, that everyone is guilty and you just have to burn this place down. And I think...
Nice comparison.
Yeah, really.
Thank you. It just struck me today, yeah. But, that's fascinating to me, because the idea of the heroic gunslinger who can travel from town to town sorting things out is obviously pivotal to the Western. And here, it's presented as a deal with the devil. Perhaps literally.
Yeah.
It's as I say, there's a lot of interesting ideas in the film. I just sort of wish they'd been pushed a bit further. Weirdly, I'm reminded of a classic Western, High Noon, which similarly features a marshal, a sheriff, who is coming up against a bunch of desperados, and the town doesn't help him. And notably, the final moment of that film, spoiler, the marshal, played by Gary Cooper, throws away his badge. So I remember this documentary I saw about Westerns long ago, might even have been about Clint Eastwood, says that there's that moment when the marshal throws away his badge. It's saying that he can save the town, but the town is not worth saving. And speaking of Don Siegel, as was mentioned earlier, we see that in Dirty Harry, where at the end of Dirty Harry, Harry Callahan, Clint Eastwood, throws away his badge. This town is not worth saving. But I wish that had been sort of, that idea, that conceit, had been pushed further in High Plains Drifter. Still, of course, it was only I think Eastwood's third film as director, his second Western, after The Outlaw Josie Wales.
At first, actually, The Outlaw Josie Wales came a couple of years later.
Oh, odd. Okay, fair enough. So his second directorial film after Play Misty for Me.
That's right,
yeah. For my money, he I mentioned it earlier, he got the whole balance right of presenting that way of presenting the birth of America and all this violence and so on in Unforgiven. But I suppose a lot of it was born out of High Plains Drifter and others at the time.
Yeah, I think you'd struggle to disagree with the idea that Unforgiven is a more mature and sophisticated film, but High Plains Drifter is still a hell of an ambitious thing for a second film.
I've often wondered why it is we have children. And the conclusion I've come to is we want someone to get it right this time. But not me. Personally speaking, I can't wait to watch life tear you apart.
Hello, India.
little interlude here where we talk about what's going to be coming up in an upcoming episode. It's been a while since we've done one of these. It's the reason why we changed from season 2 to 3, because everybody got a two-parter, but now it's just those who truly deserve it. And so in an upcoming episode, one of my favourite all-time directors, Park Chan-wook. So
Wowzers.
very instrumental in me liking the movies I do, that man.
I can see it. Yeah.
And it's weird to think, I don't want to say like, oh, he sold out, but I could say the same with Bong Joon-ho, but he feels very establishment. And there seems to be a sense of danger about Park Chan-wook still, a sense of cool, distant, sort of weird, cool,
you
weird.
never quite know when he's gonna like have a guy eat a live octopus on film. That's something you can say
He's
about
a bit of a renegade, isn't he?
Yeah. And yet
I like
they all
that.
have had this international career, and I think they've benefited from the fact that there's no sort of prestige gap between Hollywood and South Korean cinema now. It's like, for anyone else, if they'd gone back to their home country after making Okja or after making Stoker, previously that would have been what a director does when they've had their ass kicked and they've got their tails between their legs. But they went back to their home country and delivered two of the best films they've ever made that were massive international hits. So, you know, it's an exciting time. It's all new now. You know, the old certainties are all up in the air.
Yeah. And I also think he's outgrown, because the only reason anybody ever knew him was Old Boy. It's like, just that's it. That was his entire legacy.
It's different now. I think The Handmaiden's probably what people associate him with most now, I would say. Yeah.
And even
I
then,
love
that
Old
track-
Boy, but it's,
Oh, yeah,
he's done
same.
far better. Far better.
Yeah. And even then, like, the traction that he's got after Decision to Leave as well has been pretty palpable too. So
True.
he's definitely like still establishing his name now. So
Yeah, it's so hard to know what to do. I think this might be one of the ones that I didn't put myself down for, because when you were sending the spreadsheet around, there were already like 92 people who wanted to be on the Park Chan-wook episode. I thought, oh, it's nice, I can take a holiday. But if that is the case, let the record show that I absolutely love Park Chan-wook, even if I'm not on his episode.
Hard to say what to do, but I think you have. I would love to do Lady Vengeance, because I think it's his best movie.
So good, yeah.
Beyond that, I'm totally open. Whatever anybody wants to do, but Lady Vengeance is the biz.
It's good when you've got an embarrassment of riches like that, though, isn't it? You can just pick anything and you think, well, you know you're on for a good, really.
Yeah.
Yeah, the few and far between. I don't think he's done one movie which people don't like, but he said he made it because he's done an awful lot of movies that his daughter couldn't watch because they're all violent, sort of nasty violent movies. So he made I'm Not a Robot. I'm Not a Cyborg, sorry, for his daughter.
But that's the one he made for his like kids.
Yeah, it's not really
a horrifying scene of self-mutilation.
Korea's different, all right.
It's nicer than his normal movies. I'll give it that.
It's cute. It's cute.
Yeah.
Taggart!
Yes, sir?
I've decided to launch an attack that will reduce Rock Ridge to ashes.
What do you want me to do, sir?
I want you to round up every vicious criminal and gunslinger in the West. Take this down. I want rustlers, cutthroats, murderers, bounty hunters, desperados, mugs, pugs, thugs, nitwits, halfwits, dimwits, vipers, snipers, con men, Indian agents, Mexican bandits, muggers, buggerers, bushwhackers, hornswagglers, horse thieves, bull dykes, train robbers, bank robbers, ass kickers, shit kickers, and Methodists!
Could you repeat that, sir?
The third movie, and a very left field turn in some ways, but in other ways, not so much really. 1974's Blazing Saddles by Mel Brooks. So, Mark, you are the only one who's not synopsized. I mean, it's a simple one, this.
Don't have
As they
to
all are.
synopsize Blazing Saddles. It's ridiculous.
You should start talking about Louis Pasteur, and just so one of us can shout, "Enough of that shit! Mongo is here!" Line delivered by David Huddleston, by the way, the Big Lebowski himself.
Yeah, and Santa Claus the movie.
But I don't think it really needs an explanation here. I mean, there's a town, a corrupt official wants to make his money, and to do that, he needs to divert a railway through a up-and-coming town. I can't remember what the name of the town was, but yes. And into that, there's Cleveland Little, who is arrested for smacking a frying pan over the back of Slim Pickens' head. There we go.
Oh, yeah.
He's arrested, and by contrivance, he becomes the mayor of this town, and he has to sort of stop it from hook or crook, really.
Sorry, don't you mean sheriff rather than mayor?
Yes, sorry. Yes, right. Yeah. He is the sheriff, and he's assisted by Gene. Oh, I'm really bad with names today.
Gene Wilder playing Jim.
The Waco kid, Jim.
Yes. And our central character is called Bart, played by Cleveland Little. Cleavon Little. Cleavon.
He wasn't a great actor, but it was a shame he wasn't more prominent, because he was a real charismatic guy.
One of those frustrating things where, you were constantly aware that part was meant to be Richard Pryor. But Pryor was...
Yeah, I don't think he'd have been...
his drug habit at the time.
I don't think he'd have been as good at it, honestly. I don't. Drugs habit aside, but just the charisma of Cleveland Little, I think he really...
Well, it would have been a very different film anyway, because it was supposed to be Richard Pryor and Gig Young, wasn't it? Which is a really weird partnership to consider.
Yeah, because I think Gig Young was cast as the Waco kid because Brooks thought he could draw on his real life alcohol problem. It turned out he was drawing on it slightly too much, and he was just fired for being completely pissed.
He really did. He did what he asked him to, didn't he?
Yeah.
Collapsed on the first day of filming.
But it's weird to talk about any sort of Mel Brooks movie as a genre piece, because his genre is sort of lightning paced, gag after gag after gag, and the genre, whatever it takes place in, is just basically set dressing, whether that's Hitchcock parody, Star Wars parody, what else has he done?
Horror.
Universal Monsters parody.
Yeah, it's all effectively the same movie, but just with different dressing. But
there is a wonderful review on Letterboxd that really takes umbrage with this film because it's taking the piss out of westerns. So I think you kind of missed the point.
Yeah, if I was sensitive about people making fun of westerns, I would probably watch something other than Blazing Saddles.
Yeah,
that's just me.
Agreed. Yeah,
it's a great read, though. I urge anybody to read it because it's fantastic to read.
All right. I've got to say, Rob, I'm going to disagree with you in terms of it being lightning fast.
Well, he's done it faster, but it's quick paced.
Yeah, I don't think it is. I think it's generally quite sedately paced, which is actually a problem I have with Mel Brooks's work overall. I found this with Blazing Saddles. I found it with Young Frankenstein. I found it with The Producers. Even perhaps less so with Spaceballs and Robin Hood Men in Tights. But for me, at least, the pacing of the comedy and the frequency of the gags isn't quite. It is slower than I would like. Maybe I was spoilt by the Zucker by Zaz with Airplane and The Naked Gun, but it's always been a thing which, for me, Mel Brooks is not as funny as I'd like it to be. But that's me.
Well, it's comedy, isn't it? When there is a lot of jokes, it might not be super fast like Airplane or what have you, but it's fairly speedy compared to what you think of as a comedy now, at least.
Yeah, I would agree. I think Mel Brooks's films are sort of fast. They're always fast by the standard of their times, aren't they? The Producers is quite gently paced. And then when you get into the 70s with things like this, they get a bit faster. And then, as Vincent says, by the time you get into something like Spaceballs, you've had Airplane and you've had MTV, and they're really getting quite pacey, I think.
But as a revisionist Western, what do we think of Blazing Saddles?
Well, as a revisionist Western, it is This is a movie that Blazing Saddles is a spoof. It's a spoof of the Western, much like think films like Airplane and The Naked Gun are, and Spaceballs and Robin Hood Men in Tights. But in this case, this is revising the Western by skewering some of the Western's best held tropes. The most obvious one being, I said earlier on that my parents were never particularly keen on Westerns because they found them to be pretty racist. And this is a film that absolutely skewers racism and genre tropes alike. The central thing is that the main conceit is that our main character, Bart, is black, and he is sent to be a sheriff because he will be rejected as a sheriff. And indeed he is, as he's approaching. The townspeople saying, the sheriff is a word I'm not going to use. Exactly, yes. The sheriff is a hog.
Word.
Yeah.
That word, with certain streaming platforms, they've been giving warnings before this plays, and I watched it on iPlay, and it did a similar thing there too. So
yeah, same. Which is, I think, fair to put that sort of consumer advice up front, so you know what's coming. And that's the way this is. That's the way this is being revisionary, because rather than pushing a person of color aside, Blazing Saddles places him front and center. And there's an interesting interaction that the black family in Bart's backstory have with some Native Americans. Although I'm pretty sure that we see Mel Brooks in Redface.
We do.
Which is a bit like
Yiddish as well.
Yiddish Native American
kind of becomes so racist it comes around the other way. It's bizarre.
And at the same time, it's also skewering the various tropes of the Western. Things like in that flashback sequence, Bart says that his family weren't welcome in the wagons going in the circle, so they had to form their own circle. And of course, things like and it may have cinema's most famous and enduring fart gag, where we have a bunch of, hey, look, it's a bunch of cowboys sitting around and they're eating beans. And one farts, another farts, and there's all the farting.
Beans. Very, very potent beans. They're not like Heinz.
Talk about the music.
It's interesting. Doc, speaking of another revisionist Western, Doc, I don't know if that got the jump on that, because there is a very brief fart gag in that where Stacey Keach plays Doc Holliday, and he's got Faye Dunaway playing his girlfriend, who was a sex worker in
Big Nose Katie as Doc Holliday.
Thank you. I knew there's a weird name, but I couldn't think what it was. Thank you. Yeah, and he advises her to sleep facing towards the fire rather than away from it, because she's had quite a lot of beans that evening. So I'm not sure whether that got the jump on Blazing Saddles or vice versa.
But it's interesting, isn't it, that if we talk about what these films are revising, as we did at the start, it's interesting that this is the only film of the three that really deals with race. To a modern audience, that is the thing that is glaringly wrong with a lot of Golden Age Westerns and revisionist Westerns made in more recent years, like Django Unchained or Killers of the Flower Moon, are obviously very focused on that. And it's sort of irreverent, but it has a kind of sincerity at its heart. It's the only, maybe Young Frankenstein, I guess, but it's the only Mel Brooks film that really looks good, I think. I don't think that's necessarily something that comedies have to do, but it's got that big opening credit that says shot in Technicolor. It's, goes out on location a lot. It seems like he cared about making this look like a big, serious Western. I mean, the ultimate sign of this is, again, right at the beginning of the film, where it has this amazing theme song by Frankie Lane.
Yeah.
Where Brooks said the reason why it sounds like that is that no one had the guts to say to Frankie Lane, oh, by the way, it's a parody. We're not making a serious Western. He was so into it, and it shows.
That's a nice story.
It's another one of those films that's sort of saying, in its own roundabout, irreverent way, what is American society built upon. And
Yeah.
again, it's another inequality, isn't it? It's
Yeah.
racism. I mean, I think it's an interesting one. I've heard people say this. I've heard people argue whether this, because it uses the N word huge amount, whether they could class it as racist.
Well, a quarter, an ounce compared to a Quentin Tarantino movie.
That's true. That is true. Yeah.
And a Quentin Tarantino, I mean, if maybe it doesn't say it enough, if it was saying it more, it'd be critically acclaimed. Maybe that's the thing which is working for Tarantino, his use of the N word.
I don't think this film has I mean, I get where they're coming from, but I don't think it. Like Graham said, it's got sincerity. I don't think it intends to be racist.
Well, it's racist, but it never celebrates the racist. It's always on the side of the person who's been subjugated and oppressed, and I think that sort of defends
it's
it from
racism. There's a big difference between presenting
exactly
something
right.
and doing
that's
it.
exactly right.
Oh yeah. Because some Westerns would be on the side of the side and take the perspective of the racists rather than against them. So I think that is the distinction.
I think it's important to remember it was revolutionary at the time.
Yeah.
Yeah. But the average rap song says N more than that now. So it's not like it's particularly aggressive.
Yeah.
Honestly.
I think what we're circling here is the great cliche about Blazing Saddles, which has always driven me up the wall, which is when people say you couldn't make it today. I have heard variations on that cliche going back about 25 years. And it's like, firstly, the Westerns that get made today are, as we've said, mostly by Quentin Tarantino, whose N-word usage makes this look like Dorothy Post. And it's also just sparked this weird genre of kind of parodies of itself, parodies of that cliche. There's a great Letterboxd review by Demi Agajube who says, you couldn't make this film today because several members of the key cast are dead.
Although CGI these days,
you never
dig up corpses anyway. So
or hey,
finally get Gig Young in it,
or do a remake with a new cast.
Yeah. But you're so right that can't be made. It can't be done today. It's just
there's much worse.
Oh God!
On both the racism and the language and the sexism and all sorts. There's so much it does everything worse. This is kind of quite quaint in every regard compared to what passes for racist movies or rhetoric now.
Yeah, absolutely. It's I just thought if it were remade, you know who I would love to remake Blazing Saddles? Jordan Peele.
Well, yeah. There's a man.
But he'd probably want to make a horror film instead. A horror Western.
It would be nice to see him do his comedy on the big screen because he is a ferociously funny man with his partner. Yeah. He's had me in tears with his colleague, honestly. So that would be fun tears, laughing tears.
We got that.
No, I'm upset how unfunny this is because that has been an aggressive reaction.
Basically, just you sat in your chair like Daniel Kaluuya in Get Out with that single tear going down your chair.
Yes, we're saying Jordan Peele here, not Steve McQueen.
Yeah, true. But it's I don't know. It's not a masterpiece, I don't think, of 70s comedy. I think it's not aged particularly well, not because of the racist rhetoric or it's whatever. It's just some jokes kind of play out like dad jokes.
Yeah,
it's
like,
very
a lot of dad jokes.
Yeah, it's really on the nose. There is no sort of, I feel, subtlety about it. It's like, hey, joke, bam. Hey, joke, bam. When I was watching, it was the second time I'd seen it in preparation for this, and I felt that the first time. I mentioned the pacing issue. For me, it's kind of slow, but I also feel it's so, it's intermittently funny because every joke is delivered with a sledgehammer. Like
sometimes works.
Yeah, the gag I find personally funniest is the point when Bart suddenly pulls out his own gun and pretends to be someone else, and then when he's away from everyone else, he says, "Oh, baby, you are so talented." Looks to the camera, and they are so dumb. I don't know what that for me is very funny. But I found I was going, a few times, not, as you were saying, Rob, the sort of crying with laughter type thing.
That's an interesting one. That is a particular joke that really made you laugh on this occasion. The one that got me, and it's stupid and is a dad joke, is when they ride into town and they're pillaging the town, and the guy is dragged away on a riderless horse, and you just hear him say, "Well, that's this suit ruined."
Yeah,
that just got me for some reason this time.
Yeah, the thing that I think it does worse, really, I think it wastes Madeline Kahn, because Madeline Kahn is an absolute one of the all-time great sort of comedy actors, I guess.
Yeah,
and to have her doing a stupid German accent, it's kind of a bit tacky.
Yeah, I think even having seen like Rancho Notorious and all of the old Marlene Dietrich westerns that's riffing off, it's just there's not that many jokes in that song. It's not as funny as several of the actual songs Marlene Dietrich sings in actual westerns. Yeah, but it does have some lovely stuff, and I love the whole third act with the fake town, which of course looks about as fake as every other town in a western because they're all fake. They're all just cardboard stuck up there. I think that's great. It's like Baudrillard with fart jokes.
Put that on the poster. Yeah, that's a summary of. Put that in a letterboxd review.
Yeah. The thing we have, I don't know if it's the first meta comedy, but it's the first, earliest I remember. The sort of the anarchy of the third act.
Oh yes,
yeah,
escapes the boundaries of the film and sort of returns to the film. I don't remember seeing that earlier than this, so that is a bold swing, really.
I think you can point to some Marx Brothers stuff as a precursor to it, but it's interesting how it takes it slightly further by being so meta. The Marx Brothers just broke the fourth wall, but this is a movie that expects the audience to have grown up watching the kind of westerns that are full of the kind of cliches that it's mocking, because by the 1970s they had.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it goes back to the revisionist aspect. It's revising aspects by being self-aware because it knows what it is. It knows its genre, and it knows the audience knows the genre. And in that respect, I certainly do applaud it, because I think it's always pleasing when a film knows and respects its audience.
Yeah.
Yes.
The only problem I have with the finale is that it does the same thing. It's the mass brawl pie fight gag, which was the ending of every sort of freewheeling late 60s disastrous comedy you could name, from like Casino Royale onwards. And it's weird how
you reminded me of The Party that exists, the Peter Sellers movie, which should be.
But most of them involve Peter Sellers, don't they? Any film that involves Peter Sellers ends in some sort of weird pie fight.
Even Doctor Strangelove nearly did.
Just for reference, if you don't know The Party, it's the one where Peter Sellers browns up and puts on an Indian accent.
That still doesn't narrow it down, Rob. Still doesn't narrow it down.
Well, has he done more? Has he done a lot of that?
Oh, yes.
Wow.
If he's not browning himself up, he's yellowing himself up. There's a whole thing like that.
Yeah.
Have we got an episode of Uncut Genres there? Peter Sellers' racist comedies.
Oh, definitely. Please put me down for that one if you do. Yeah, definitely.
Well, if not, you've certainly got a wide range to look at when you do when there's an episode on Peter Sellers.
There's at least a letterbox list in it. Put it that way.
Yes.
It's considerable.
Yeah, and probably a YouTube video or two.
Never mind that shit. Here comes Mungo.
So, to wrap up, we've talked about sort of the revisionist westerns sort of dipped in and out as the conversation sort of flowed, but I think you have to end this sort of episode just by some of the movies that we could have talked about, but we didn't. Recommendations for things that people could check out.
I think I said Doc, didn't I? That's quite an interesting one, because it's the same story of, Gunfight at the OK Corral, but it's it doesn't paint Doc Holliday, and it certainly doesn't paint Wyatt Earp in a good light at all. It's very Watergate sort of idea of it. It's the guy who just doesn't like the fact that one family has power in a town, and he wants it. And when they do actually have the famed gunfight, it's like almost like it's almost like a press pack descend on Wyatt Earp's farm at the end of it, and he just gives like an entire press conference to like these people and saying like, you know, they had to be dealt with, kind of thing. It's very presidential. It's an interesting post-Watergate idea of what a Western could be.
Very weird. Any others that you got there, Mark?
We did mention McCabe and Mrs. Miller. I think that was a very, very close to the bone suggestion, wasn't it? We nearly had that one on this.
It's such a great film.
It's a brilliant film, yeah. I mean, you can plot a line from that to Deadwood quite easily.
Yes.
But and then, of course, you know, you can name any of my favourite, you know, spaghetti westerns, but I mean, that's a different genre in itself. But this is when, you know, it was selling coals to Newcastle in a way, wasn't it? Because once the Italians sort of done it, and then it went back to America, and America have done it ever since. So yeah, I think that's an option as well. Yeah.
Well, Italy's always a weird sort of country, isn't it? It is the king of rip-offs, really.
Yeah.
If something's popular somewhere else, okay, we'll do that, and we'll do it for like 50p.
Yeah.
Oh, good. And somehow it'll look better. It'll look better
well at the box office. Yeah.
Yeah.
Graham, Vincent, any other? Don't have to specifically be tied to the 70s. But,
okay, good, because, I mean, I'm going to do basic bitch answers. If we hadn't done High Plains Drifter, I expect we would have probably done The Outlaw Josie Wales, which I definitely think is worth looking. And I'm going to go to 1969 and say The Wild Bunch is one that I think, because that's a wonderfully... another term that could be applied to these sorts of Westerns is they are quite often elegiac. They are providing these elegies, or if you want to get Zoolander-esque, you googly, for this genre that is, of course, still going strong. And I think The Wild Bunch does a lovely job of being on the very cusp of when this period, this perspective, this mythology is coming to an end. And there would be and hey, how would this be for a double bill to look at Westerns at the end of the West, to do a double bill of The Wild Bunch and The Power of the Dog, which is obviously in no way a 70s film, but I think continues many of the notions from this period. But yeah, those would be my picks: The Wild Bunch and The Outlaw Josie Wales.
Before handing to Graham, who probably has about 100, because he is the Western guy. There's only one that I wanted to really mention. It was an Andre de Toth one from 1959, Day of the Outlaw.
Robert Ryan.
Oh, yeah.
Yes, which is a very, very good sort of, almost represents different eras of the Western, ending with them sort of wandering out into the snow to their ultimate death.
Yeah.
Which
very good.
It's a very, very good movie. Yeah. And Andre de Toth has an eye patch on, so it's just a little bit cooler.
Yeah.
It's a simple reason, but, you know, it just is what it is. But
seriously.
So, yeah. Graham, yourself.
Well, Vincent reminded me with his Wild Bunch pick that decades in cultural terms never begin and end when they're supposed to. So I think the 70s revisionist Western is bookended in 1969 by The Wild Bunch and in 1981 by Heaven's Gate. Those feel like the beginning and the end of a coherent era of Westerns. In terms of the 70s Westerns, we had a few that nearly made the cut. I mean, you could throw anything Peckinpine, really, except Convoy. Even then, I think I could make a case for it. I'm also a huge fan of The Outlaw Josie Wales, which has some fantastic Native American characters who were worth talking about. I think we talked about the Missouri Breaks and Little Big Man. It's a really, for all that the Hollywood Western was kind of sputtering out at this point, the 70s were a really fertile era for it. In terms of very different takes on the Western, there was a brief sort of cycle in the 1960s of what I guess you could call showbiz Westerns, where they took that aspect which the Madeline Kahn character in Blazing Saddles is parodying, that they would always have this sort of exotic showgirl, usually played by Dietrich, who would have a few musical numbers, and made that the whole dish in films like Helen in Pink Tights, starring Sophia Loren, a great movie that has a sight gag that was lovingly ripped off equally effectively in one of Rob and me's favourite films, Inherent Vice. You've also got Louis Malle's extremely weird French showbiz Mexican revolutionary Western Viva Maria with Bridget Bardot and Jean Moreau. An absolutely barking film, but I like it a lot. And in terms of later sort of eras of Westerns, I think there was a really rich tranche of them coming out around the middle of the 2000s, I guess, because, again, America was in a tough position. You know, the president was presenting himself as a cowboy. You know, this needed re-examining. And that's when you got things like the assassination of Jesse James by the coward Robert Ford, which is super.
Spoiler alert.
But that has a lot of that kind of acid Western drift, and it would make a lovely double bill with The Hired Hand, I think. So yeah, those are my picks. I'll rein myself in.
Yeah, you jumped way out of the 70s there, going to 2007.
Yeah.
Then again, so did I. I went to 2020.
Yeah, you said Power of the Dog.
Yeah.
and just to be weird and say something Korean, because I think I got to represent that sort of part of my taste, The Good, the Bad, and the Weird by Kim.
It's a good film. Yeah.
Cracking
spirit.
Yeah.
Which is very revisionist, but impossibly fun.
Yeah.
Very, very good
And
movie.
also clearly made by someone who adores Westerns. I ducked that film for many years because the title made it sound kind of over wacky, and I thought, oh, is it just someone who thinks that making a Western is going to be a lark? But no, the guy is a great director, and he really loves his Westerns.
Yes, and that will bring us to a close. Coming up for the next 2 episodes, we're going back to 2-parters, only when it's actually warranted, rather than everybody gets one, like we did in Series 2. But with Park Chan-wook, one of my favourite directors, so looking forward to talking about him.
Jolly good.
Okay, so Mark, where can we find you on the internet?
You can find me on letterboxd.com. You can find me at The Geek Show, obviously. You can find me at We Are Cult, Horrified, Z Network in America, the political magazine, and yeah, I think that's it. I often pop up on Pop Screen to annoy Graham. I think that's it. I think that's my limit at the moment.
Graham.
Well, my main berth is, as Mark said, Pop Screen, the fortnightly podcast where we look at a different movie, either starring or about a pop star. I write sometimes for Byline Times and its Substack supplement. I'm regularly on The Geek Show, of course, and yeah, that's the visible surface of my work. I'm doing a lot of things that may bear fruit eventually, but and also subscribe to the Geek Show Patreon, where every week I have a new review of the X-Files up there, as well as some archive reviews of Doctor Who.
Yeah. And by the time this goes out, last night for February will be out, as well as the first series for the Mr. Vampire sort of spin-off of this.
Oh, I'm looking forward to that.
And Vincent, where can we find you?
You can find me somewhere out there beyond the edge of where you can see. Or indeed, you can find me on the interwebs. Check out my podcast, Invasion of the Poddy People, via the Not Just for Kids movie club. And you can also find me at Dr. Gain, that's DRGAINE, on X, Instagram, Threads, Blue Sky, Letterboxd. See my reviews on The Geek Show, The Critical Movie Critics, and my blog, Vincent's Views, where I post links to my various podcast appearances. And Rob, if I wanted to hire you to be my gunslinger, where would I find you?
Oh, he's turned it around on me there. Very good. You can find me across all of the social medias, including Letterboxd, Twitter, and Instagram, which are the main ones, at Uncut Robcast, where you can keep up to date with everything, just everything in life,
in the world. Yeah,
just. It's like the beginning of one of those movies. Say, what? How did the story begin? Well, we'll go back to the beginning of time, and that's how it works. Yes, It's a Charlie Kaufman movie.
Aren't we all in a Charlie Kaufman movie?
Yes. But until next time with Park Chan-wook, thank you for listening. And a weird cadence. Thank you for listening.
Thank you for listening.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening.
All staying in. Great ending. Thank you very much.